Welcome back to Tell Me More with CJ Quarterbaum. This is a place for people who are curious about life and want to know more about the world around them. So today, we get to do that in what is very likely going to be a 3-part episode because there is so much to talk about with this one. We're going to talk about everything: Gen Z, leadership, and some aspect of preparing for the future. I am joined by Dr. Charisse Taylor. Charisse, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So as always, I'd like to start by saying, tell the people, who are you? Where are you from? And what are you doing now?
Sure. So I am a trendy American girl from Brooklyn. That is who I am. I'm also a former assistant superintendent of 2 school districts. I am a licensed therapist, executive coach, and I'm also the executive director of the nonprofit Climate Community Lab, which focuses on workforce training in the clean energy sector.
It sounds
So we
like
got
you
a
do
lot
a
of
whole
things.
lot.
I do a whole lot. So yes, we have a lot to talk about for sure.
And this is why the month of January 2025 is being kicked off with you, because you just gave me everything for the month. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Let's start with Gen Z. That's where we start here. Tell me about your experience in education, specifically with, first of all, like what you've done, how long you were in education, and then your experience with this generation.
So I started my career actually decades ago as a counselor, college and career counselor for high school students. I initially had students who were at the bottom 5%, most likely to not go on to college. And so my job was to figure out what their post-secondary plan was going to be. And in that, I just found a lot of students who were not knowledgeable about what their career options actually were, had no sense of what their skills, what their strengths or weaknesses were. And then they also just had a lot of fear and anxiety around feeling a sense of accomplishment because many of them had traditionally not been successful in school. So I did that for almost 6 years. And that was a really great, fertile training ground for me because after that time, I went on to work for the New York City Department of Ed, the Office of Post-Secondary Readiness. And there, I was able to take the individual students that I was working with and keep them in mind as I began to build programs at scale for a district that at the time was serving 1.1 million students.
New York City public schools would be, if I remember this correctly, that just the students alone, that 1.1 million would be the 10th largest city in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. Currently, the numbers, I think they're just under a million. They're at like 960 something thousand. I think is the last number I saw. But that still makes them the largest school district in the country. The next largest school district, I think, is at like 600 and something thousand. I think it's LA Unified, which is about 600 or 700. So like there's a huge gap, right, between like New York and the rest of the world.
I mean, isn't there always?
On so many measures, right? Exactly. On so
New
many
York
measures.
and nothing, baby. And it's Brooklyn over everything if we get it right. So, all right. So what'd you do after leaving the New York City DOE?
Yeah, so after that, so I had an opportunity to get a doctorate for free. I'm at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And so I went. And after my 3 years there, I went on to become an assistant superintendent in 2 school districts here in Massachusetts. So for me, when I graduated, the thinking was, I now know that the New York City Department of Education, or New York City Public Schools as they're called now, is not the typical school district. And so I wanted to experience what working in a typical school district was like. So I did that for several years and what it was really like. I learned how to interact with school committees. I learned how to interact with city and town officials. I got a really great training on intergenerational relationships. Most school committee members are actually retirees or those close to retiring, and they have very different views, in some cases, different views from the teachers and staff that work in schools and work directly with students. So as you think about power dynamics, which I'm sure we'll get into more later, but if you think about power dynamics, right, it's the people that are, in some cases, furthest away from the generation that we're educating and preparing are the ones making the final decisions on what their educational experience will look like. And so there's a lot of tension there. And I think sometimes when we look at the sort of violence in schools, like people are always talking about this proliferation of violence in schools. We're talking about lack of like social emotional awareness and education and lack of coping skills, resilience, right? These are all the things that we have sort of hallmarked this, I don't know if we can say it here, but this post Panini era, right?
We
Like
can say
we have,
it's not monetized, so we can say whatever
okay,
we want.
great. Okay, great. Not monetized yet.
Yes.
So, right, in this post pandemic era, like these are all the things that we have lifted up as critiques of the students who have graduated during the pandemic. I mean, I graduated with my doctorate at the start of the pandemic. Literally, I was working on my dissertation. The project that I was working on had to shut down March 7th. The world closed down on March 13th, and I had a virtual dissertation defense in May. So I feel for those who graduated from whether it was middle school, high school, college during that time. It was I won't say lackluster, right? Because I think that people did what they can. I know in my community especially, people rallied to make the day special, make the experience special for me. But it definitely was unprecedented for sure. For sure.
Yeah. So gosh, there's so many different ways and places we can go here. I want to go back to something you said initially, which was you left the New York City public school system and you realized that it's not like anywhere else. And you wanted to see what quote unquote normal school districts are like. What were some of the biggest differences between New York and the Boston area schools?
Yeah. So I would say um one, funding formulas. So the New York City Public Schools uses fair student funding, a fair funding formula, so that it is not actually as under resourced as we're often led to believe. I think it's just a matter of how the funds are being used, and that's all I'll say on that. And
Just in case you go back.
right, in case I go back, and also like New York City Public Schools has been in the news quite a bit lately, and New York City government has been in the news quite a bit lately. But so that's one thing. Also, this concept of school committees and the power of school boards in New York City Public Schools. There's the PEP panel. It's the panel, if I remember correctly, panel for educational policy. They meet a few times a year and they vote on some policy things. But as someone who was serving as a district leader, I had no interaction with them and I didn't feel the impact of any of their decisions on the programs that I was creating for the high schools that I was serving. Now, as an assistant superintendent of student services or of strategy or of operations, right, which are the buckets that I oversaw in my district I was in, I had a lot of interaction with the school committee, right? And that's everything from school committee members doing visits regularly at schools to school committee members inquiring about hiring decisions to school committee members stopping hiring because of their concerns around budget and around policy and all those things. Now, a school committee functions very similarly to a nonprofit board in that their responsibility is policy and budget. But when everything in a system costs money, it's very easy to make the claim that everything is budget related. Right. So if I as a school committee member ask you about your curriculum choice, right, as a assistant superintendent or superintendent, really if you had superintendent, I would say, this is what our professional opinion, this is what we have chosen, we believe is right for our district. A school committee member could come back and say, well, actually, we will not approve funding for that because we don't like it. If you look right now, there's a whole debate around Lucy Calkins and the Readers and Writers Workshop and how it's been deemed to be ineffective. But there are a ton of districts nationally that are still using it. And it's because it's Lucy, because of the prestige around it coming from Teachers College, Columbia University, right? And it's something that people are familiar with, but it's been deemed to be ineffective.
Is that the reading thing where they don't use phonics? Instead, it's
Correct. The whole language approach. Yep.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, a whole lot of backlash, right? So a parent group sued. So for context, a parent group here in Massachusetts sued a school district and Teach College. And I don't know, I cannot say that they sued Lucy specifically. I don't think they did. But basically saying that this curriculum did not teach their children to read, and that what it was promised to do. Now, there have been, it's so complex. I didn't think we were going to talk about this today, but it's really interesting, right? Because so Ed Reports, which is sort of the clearinghouse for high quality instructional materials, HQIM, what we call it in education. So Ed Reports has been saying for years that that curriculum should not be used and that it's not deemed as high quality material. But districts have been using it and they've insisted on using it because it came from Columbia University, right? So like as we think about prestige and where is the source of truth and what we choose to believe, I think the other layer in that, which is interesting, that the districts that those parents who sued came from have high percentages of students who have private tutoring.
Interesting.
And so there could be an economic argument there too, where parents are like, I'm tired of supplementing my child's education and I need the school district to deliver on what my property taxes are paying for them to do. Yeah, it's very fascinating. It's very, very fascinating stuff. So as you think about, right, so we're still talking about like educating young people and like having them pass through these kinds of systems, right? You know, Gen Zers are late teens, early 20s, mid 20s at this point, right?
Nah, they pushing 30.
Gen Zers are pushing 30?
Gen Zers are pushing 30. Gen Z is 95 to 2012 or 97 to 2012.
Okay. Oh, these are my high school kids. My kids who were in high school. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. So I think that like, so this actually does really connect because in the 90s and early 2000s is when everybody was pushing this kind of curriculum and curricula like this that later has now proven to be ineffective, right? So in some ways, we as educators, I don't want to be so hard to say that we have failed this generation
No, we
academically.
failed them. I
So
will say it.
we have not provided them with the necessary tools to be successful. And I think that as I look now as someone who is now hiring Gen Zers, largely, I mean, given the work that I do, I hire people from really across generations. A lot of my technical trainers are actually, they are boomers or early Gen Xers. And then my program managers are traditionally Gen Zers. And so that's even interesting to see how they interact with each other. And also they have very different definitions of what good looks like.
Tell me more.
So I'll give you an example. So we recently went through a hiring process looking for, I'm a technical trainer. So my program manager, who is a he is a Gen Zer, I said, come through, like, let's do the interview process together because I want you to see how I do it. And I want you to see, like, what are the things, let's debrief it because this will be a skill for you to develop, right? Like how to hire well and like what are the things that you need to look for. So we would meet with someone and then we would have like a follow-up conversation. He was very much, he was gung-ho, like in the first rounds, okay, we need to give this person a chance. Like, I'm going to repeat the question. I'm going to rephrase the question. I'm going to like try to make this like accessible as possible. Right. And then by the time we got to, and I let him do it. Right. So I think that these are things that I did early on, right. When I was hiring, because I wanted to ensure that particularly people from marginalized backgrounds had what they needed to be successful. Now we got to our final candidates. One candidate didn't do so well in the interview. He was late, was having technology issues, those kinds of things, right? The program manager was like, I don't know, this person's just not polished. And I said, the person is a technician. They're all like this. Like, this is actually like, as you interact with technicians in the field, there is particularly in this industry, there is a persona, there is an archetype. What we're looking for is actually ability to grow ability to take feedback, and based on the content they do know, because in education we know that, right? Like if someone's got like we know what the raw material of a teacher looks like, right? And we know whether or not we can coach them up. So I said, that's what we're looking for. And so it was very interesting to see. And then where he and I were aligned on like some candidates that we didn't think were good, it was interesting in the reasons why, right? So like some of the reasons from the Gen Zer would have been candidates' communication style or lack of engagement. Whereas for me, as someone who sits at the cusp of Gen X and millennials, I'm that bridge. I look at ability to grow. I look at demonstration of expertise, right? So like Gen X and above are very big on technical knowledge, right? Technical knowledge, showing what you know, facts, not feelings, right? Like you'll hear that from Gen Xers and above, right? So,
I
you
actually
know,
used that in the conversation today.
right? So we were looking for different things, right? Like we had different definitions of good. And that's something that I've noticed, right, in working with even some past trainers that I've had who sit in the early Gen X, late boomer stage, very different definitions of what good looks like, different definitions around leadership and organizational culture and what collaboration looks like, who has the final say, accepting critique, right? Like it's very different. In my experience, it's been early millennials. I'll say early millennials. I would say even like 37, 38 and older. Not just understand hierarchy. I'll say this. I think millennials are very gifted at not only understanding the hierarchy, but learning how to navigate within it to their own benefit. Whereas I have found in my experience with Gen Xers and boomers, they defer to the hierarchy and don't challenge it or don't question, don't think about challenging it, right? It becomes this there's a lot of leadership by, well, the boss said we got to do it. So we're just, boss said we got to do it, right? So there's like an abdication of responsibility because I'm not the person in charge.
That's so funny. I can think of someone I have in the past worked with, or currently, we will not say, who their entire thing is they're an Xer. It's, hey, it's what the boss says. The boss says goes. And me as a millennial, I'm like, yeah, the boss said it, but that's not right. So what are we going to do? And then
Correct.
you can kind of see that. And then I think what we often see with Zers is they just want everything to be flat. They don't want a hierarchy. We're all equal. And there's almost this idea there's no dues to pay. I walk
Yes,
in and my opinion is just as valid. My expertise is just like yours. No, it's not. You haven't done this for as long as we have. You haven't paid your dues yet. You don't get to come in and 3 years out of college command a 6-figure salary because that's not how it
correct.
works.
Correct. Absolutely. And I think also, like, one of the things that I think is also interesting, right, as we think about this debate around is college for everyone has sort of flipped to less of a debate, but more of a declaration that college is not for everyone. And so you've got millennials and above who were taught, and I very much, I have 3 degrees from expensive places, right? From prestigious expensive places, right? And so we were taught, my generation was always taught, you get the degree from the best place possible because your education will be something that leverage, right? Culturally, as a Caribbean American, we're taught, you know, your work needs to speak for itself, right? Like your work should boast for you. You shouldn't boast for yourself. And so we're taught this sort of technocratic ideology, right? Like we are the technocrats. There's this innate desire to be expert at things and to be able to demonstrate yourself as expert because that is where your self-worth, your sense of accomplishment, your value in society comes from your ability to produce and your ability to produce, depending on the environment, to produce with a level of excellence. And so that is very different, very, very different from Gen Z. I agree with you. There is this belief that things are flat. There is this belief that I went to college was enough. I don't need to go to grad school. I'm here. And so because I'm here, I should get what I get. And I think that this could be a whole other topic, but I think the idea of work-life balance and I think psychological safety, I think these are two important concepts. And as an executive coach, I've worked primarily with leaders of color. I've worked with leaders of color who've had these terms weaponized against them.
We're going to come back to that.
Yeah. And so
We will come back to that.
I think that some of these concepts, right? Like, should we be working till we drop? Absolutely not. Right. Because I always say, when you die, they're going to say that person was nice, post the job because we need to backfill this. Right. And that's the reality. And two things can be true, right? Dichotomous truths exist. If you're getting paid to do a job, like you're there to do a job, right? Like the idea that work is supposed to fulfill your social, emotional, and like life purpose fulfillment. Some people get that, not everybody does. Right. And like in actuality, the common cause that at work that you're aligned around is the mission of the organization, whether it's a for profit and it's raising margins 25% and selling whatever it is you're selling, whether it is a nonprofit organization that's focused around, like mine, environmental justice and economic mobility for people from marginalized communities, right? Like that is the thing that we're aligned on. Not necessarily whether or not we have enough vacation time or whether or not we're able to have group chats and like other things, right? Like what we're actually aligned and galvanizing around is the work and cause of the organization. And I think that from the folks I've coached, I see that getting lost with a lot of the Gen Z employees.
So I will, in defense of Gen Z, say that a large part of that problem is what companies have often sold them. So you, in the interview process and all of that, you're selling this. I think Gen Z, they're kind of our spiritual children as millennials. And
yes,
we were the first ones to talk about work-life balance. We were the first ones to talk about flattening the hierarchy. We were the first ones to talk about psychological safety in the workplace. And a lot of these companies, in the rush for recruitment and to get the best people possible, would say to you in the interview, we're a family here. We're this, we're that. Like, come see all these good things about us. And in reality, what they were doing was selling you a bill of goods. And so for Gen Z, they're like, well, you sold me a dream. And now that I'm here and you're not living up to that dream, I don't know how to navigate those waters. And so I'm not going to put that solely on them. I had a job interview at a place. It was a large nonprofit. And in the interview, there's the two people that I was interviewing with. It was an Asian woman and a white man. I think it's important to clarify that. They were talking so much about how we're a family here and this is great. Now I'm in the building. I'm noticing ain't too many chocolate brothers in there. Maybe one sister. I'm like, all right, okay. I'm listening. We're a family. We love each other. We take care of each other. Oh my goodness, this one was in this one's wedding and they showed up at the baby shower. And, we really look out for the health of our employees. And I go, okay. And this is like a 10-minute rant. She goes on, tell me about 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement and how you supported your workers of color in the room.
you asked.
Yeah. You see, I am
Yeah.
my listeners know, they read my work, they listen to my podcast. I am at a space and place in my life where the mantra for 2025 is decisions must be made. And in order for us to make good decisions, we need as much information as possible. So now I'm sitting in this room and you're telling me about how family oriented you are and how much you all love each other and care for each other. And I go, hey, how'd you care for your workers of color in 2020? This woman goes on a 7-minute rant about how we're not a counseling organization. We don't, like, you got to leave that stuff at home, yada, yada, yada.
I thought they
and I go,
were a family.
Wait a minute. You just went on all this rant about being a family. And now I asked, what did you do for a certain part of your family that was hurting? And all of a sudden, you're not a counseling organization. That's not what you're here for.
Right.
So you're selling me a bill of goods. But what you told me in that moment is when my stuff hits the fan, you don't got space for that.
Yeah. And I think that I thank you for bringing up that example. And I think that I have seen and I have experienced you organizational leaders using the term family as a way to overwork and under support their employees, right? So for me, it's actually a bit of a flag, not necessarily red, but like a little yellow
Orange,
when
bright orange.
when I hear organizations describe themselves in that way, because the reality is I can't fire my family, even if I
Mm,
want to. I
mm.
can't,
I can
right?
name a few people.
So can I.
That this brings another example to my mind of a place that I worked at where the whole thing was in the recruitment. We're a family, we take care of each other, blah, blah, blah. And what they did was they pulled a bait and switch on me. They said, we're bringing you in to do one thing, but in reality, I ended up doing another. And so when I bring this to their attention, where I'm like, hey, this isn't what I signed up for. It's not what I came here to do. They immediately tried to flip that. Oh, well, what happened to the team player? What happened to the person who was just willing to help? There's a difference between a willingness to help and this being the only thing I'm doing. And they try to use that coded language of family to now make you feel like, oh, well, you're not really being a good family member because you have desires and expectations. And also you were sold a bill of goods that you expected to come to pass.
Yeah. And I mean, also, what they're actually promoting is a very toxic family environment, right? Like, because you're a family doesn't mean that you get to step on the other person. It doesn't mean that you get to lie and deceive them. It does mean that there's some grace, but it also means that there's some honesty. So if you're actually acting and transparency as well. So if an organization is choosing to use that moniker of family as a core value, then there needs to be some work to make that actionable, right? And to what are the look fors? How would I know, like we call them look fors in education, how would I know what trust looks like in an organization? How would I know that like the organization's living out their values, right? Like there are things that we should be able to see, things that I should be able to hear in conversations between employees. There are outcomes that should be present if an organization is living out their core values. So yeah, family. This family language is very tricky, and I
So
always
we're
start
going to
with
put a
you
pin in
can't
this.
fire.
We're going to put a pin in this and we're going to come back to it. But
Yeah,
I will simply say, Gen Z, your coworkers ain't your family.
no, they're
All right,
not.
that's it.
They're not.
We're gonna
But
wrap up
I will say, they're not your family. But it doesn't mean that you can't have authentic relationships at work.
that part.
Right? And so I think that the key is to not go in with the expectation that your coworkers or that your supervisor owes you a familial relationship, and be open. You may find your next mentor, or better yet, your sponsor in that relationship. And that's why it's important to approach your whatever work environment or job you're in as someone who is capable and competent and excited to be there.
I think there's a very big difference between family and authentic relationships. Because I got a
Absolutely.
lot of authentic relationships with people who ain't family. And I got a lot of family I don't have authentic relationships with. So
Same.
we're gonna wrap up this Gen Z portion of the conversation. But I want to do that asking you to tell me one piece of advice you would give to just this generation.
Take your financial health seriously.
Sweet baby Jesus.
Yeah. I think in whether that means paying down your debt, whether that means paying attention to credit now, whether that means um, figuring out how to have multiple streams of income, everyone's situation is different, but take your financial health and well-being very seriously.
So
Hey, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure you tune in next week as Charisse and I continue our discussion, but this time talking about leadership. As I ask her to tell me more.